Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages in the most fun and effective way possible, and how can you sound natural in your target language or any foreign language that you're trying to reach fluency in. Well, in order to address this question and answer it properly, there are a few points that need to be made in order for us to understand, first of all, what sounding natural actually means, because unless we identify what our goal is fully, and it's difficult really to talk about how to get there. So to sound natural does not mean to sound native. Now, if you're interested in whether or not you can sound exactly like a native speaker, I've got a dedicated video, link in the description. But today we're talking about and focusing on sounding natural. So you can sound very natural when you're speaking a foreign language, even though you still have a little bit of an accent, even though you still mispronounce here and there. So the two things do work hand in hand, sounding as close to a native speaker as possible and sounding as natural as possible. And there is some overlap, but they're not the same thing. Sounding natural means that the way you pronounce, speak the foreign language that you're trying to learn doesn't sound too forced, artificial, and fake. And in this case, and I really hope I don't sound arrogant because I'm not, I'm just trying to stress a point. I think I'm a good example of that because I don't sound 100% like a native speaker when I speak English. You can still tell by the way I orchestrate and intonate my sentences, by the way I sometimes pronounce or even mispronounce some words. You can tell that I don't sound like a native speaker. You can tell this guy's English, it's not his first language. However, I think I do sound quite natural. I believe the way I pronounce things, first you can tell, I suppose, that I picked up my English in the UK as a teenager, in the sense that it's a little bit of a mix between a way an Italian would pronounce, being Italian being my first language, and the way someone who speaks English in the UK sounds like. So it's kind of a mix. There is a bit of that and a bit of that. Not sure about the percentages, kind of sort of depends on who I'm speaking with and where I am. One thing I notice is that when I go back to London or to England, I sound more English. When I come back to Italy or go somewhere else, the Italianness comes back, if that makes any sense. Anyways, let's not focus on me. The only reason why I was saying that is because I think I'm a good example of someone who does not sound 100% native when they speak English. However, I do sound natural if I say so myself. The first thing you need to do is identification. Identification is the first step and the first thing you need to do in order to be able to begin your journey into sounding as natural as possible. Well, when we say identification, what we are trying to identify is those pronunciation patterns or characteristics that make a native speaker stand out. Let me give you a couple of examples, but really there are so many that I should probably make a dedicated video. For instance, coming from an Italian perspective, and which we can share with a lot of Romance language speakers anyways. Very common one, a lot of people know this, but in Italian we do not have the th sound and we don't have the th sound, unless you have like from Florence, I suppose. Hence, a lot of Italian speakers tend to substitute those sounds when they find them in English. And what that sounds like is, instead of saying the day, they will say the day. And instead of saying I think, they will say I think or I think. Now, the reason why I was telling you, you do need to choose a target accent as well, and that is a big part of sounding natural, is to not mix and match too much. The first example, when I said the day, I mean, it just sounds foreign, doesn't it? But the second example, well, if you want to sound like a Cockney, I suppose you can say I think with an F, and if you want to sound like, I think some people in Ireland do pronounce the TH like a T, I think. I've heard people say that. Right now, I was kind of focusing on what could be considered an RP, received pronunciation, but then again, this sort of applies to lots of different accents. Identify an accent, mimic that, and try to not mix match too much. That is one way to sound natural, because if you start a sentence and you sound kind of English, but then you end the sentence sounding like an American, and then your next sentence you sound like you're from Boston, and then following sentence you sound like you're from New York, but then you sound like someone from California, then you go back to Manchester. It's weird. Case in point, choose an accent and try to identify what characteristics set that specific accent aside. The interdental sound, the TH, I think is something that most people know, but here is one that a lot of people actually don't notice, the short I sound. So as you know, in English, the I can be pronounced, we are usually taught in school, that it can be pronounced as a I or it can be pronounced as a E. And the second one is actually a mistake that people do teach. And when I say people, I mean non-native teachers, English teachers. Italians were teaching English, and I suppose this happens a lot in other Romance countries as well. The I is only pronounced E in a handful of situations in English, for example, the word machine. But in the vast majority, I want to say 98%, if not 99% of cases, when the I is not pronounced I, it will be pronounced with a sound that is very natural to English speakers, and I believe some German speakers and Scandinavian speakers, but not the Romance speakers. And it's a sound that is in between the E and the E. So it's basically more of a, for instance, sit, limerick, knitting, rather than sit, limerick, knitting. Once again, it depends on the accent. In Scotland, that one does become a full-on E, like chicken instead of chicken, but you know what I mean. And as a one last example, another thing you could identify, still looking into vowels, I'm not even looking into consonants very much, but let's say the O, for example. In a Southern English accent, you'll notice that sometimes it's pronounced like a O, like in pot, not, and sometimes it's pronounced more like a, like in glove, money, front. Knowing which one is which really helps you sound more natural if you select that specific accent. On the other hand, if you want to sound more like a Northern English speaker, then all of the O in those scenarios are pronounced O, so it becomes glove, money, love. Now, there are, of course, loads of examples that need to be identified, and I would need, as I was saying, a massive dedicated video, language by language, because I could do the same in Italian, in Mandarin, in Japanese. But for now, just consider the fact we want to identify how native speakers of the selected accent in the selected language, that is our target language, we want to identify, okay, so naturally I would say it like this, but they say it like that. Let me try and identify these, maybe take some notes, listen a lot, and then try to mimic that. This first step is actually the easiest one, believe it or not. It takes a lot of time, attention, precision, but it's easy because that's what a lot of people do. Yes, there are some students or some language students that prefer to, not care and they just do it randomly, and that's okay. If that's the sort of level, they will never go beyond a certain level when it comes to their pronunciation, but if that's what they want to do, and occasionally if that's all they can do, that's okay. But if you're a full-on language student, all to gain and nothing to lose. So it is something that I think you should look into. But this is something that a lot of students do. So what's so difficult about this? Well, sounding natural requires another step. And this second step that I'm going to talk about today is one that instead many people fail. Avoid overcompensation. A very common phenomenon, and it happened to me as well when I was in my late teens and I was picking up English. Now, overcompensation in general happens when, for example, you notice a feature, said language. For example, in English, the H is usually aspirated, pronounced. Once again, it depends on the accent. The Cockneys drop all of their H's. But I'm saying, let's say you're just trying to learn a more of a standard approach to the accent, and you notice, English people do pronounce the H. That might sound obvious to you, but it's not obvious. It wasn't obvious to me because in Italian the H is called mutina, which means the little mute, because we never pronounce it in Italian. Hence, for an Italian, saying hence with an aspirated H is something you need to learn. Now, for some people, they can pick it up very easily, but other people, they overcompensate. And overcompensation means that this is what happens to the following sentence. Original pronunciation. I have a lot of hats. No aspiration. Correct pronunciation. I have a lot of hats. Overcompensated pronunciation. I have a lot of hats. Now the third one tends to happen to someone who naturally would speak like the first instance, notices or is told, hey, in English the H is pronounced, and so they go, oh, in English I need to pronounce the H, and then they aspirate everywhere because they can't control it because of overcompensation. So this is overcompensation in general terms. Now, let's apply it to sounding natural. Now, do you remember when we were talking about those characteristics that we needed to identify on step 1 when it comes to native speakers? Let's say that I was listening to, because I've given a lot of examples in British English, let's have a look at a couple of examples in American English. Let's say that I was watching a video by Charlie, Critical, Penguin Zero. And as I'm listening, I immediately spot, because let's say I really like his accent and I want to pick it up. I'm listening to him and I notice, hey, wait, let me go back there. I notice how he pronounces this word. Let's say the word that I would pronounce as soft. I can't actually do it well, but just to give you an example, I'm going to butcher it, but it's just for an example. Let's say that he sounds more like soft rather than soft. Soft. In order to sound natural, I need to do it and repeat it but in a very relaxed way. Relaxation is key when you want to sound natural, because native speakers sound relaxed when they speak, and even speakers who are tense by nature of their accent, say someone who speaks in a very posh way, and they're all like, you've got a lot of people, some British people do that. It's not only the posh that do it, some posh just tend to speak slowly, but there are some people in England that have this thing, like, they speak a lot like this. It's not very relaxed, right? Some people do that. That actually didn't sound very posh because I killed the T at the end, but you know what I mean. Even people who have a non-relaxed way of speaking, they still do it in a relaxed way because they do it all the time and it's normal to them. As a non-native speaker, when I try and mimic someone's accent, what I could end up doing is I notice the feature, oh, his O in soft is closer to a, and then I overdo it because to me is what stands out, and so I'll go soft. Imagine, for example, someone who wants to sound a bit more British and they notice, oh, the British say British sometimes, they kill the T. And so you start going, British. Now it's not natural anymore. So in order to sound natural, the next step after identification is avoiding overcompensation. Whatever characteristic you noticed in the accent of a native, do not caricaturize it. Do not enlarge it and enhance it too much because you noticed it and you want people to notice that you're picking up that accent, and so you overdo it because you want people to notice it. But that is gonna kill how natural you sound, and it's gonna backfire horribly. For instance, it's what happens when people try to put on an accent and they just can't do it. Like when they're like, I speak with an Italian accent. No Italian speaks like this. Why? Because what you're doing is you're taking some features of the Italian pronunciation, which are true. We Italians natives tend to stress some vowels. For example, usually it's not the last vowel, but the one preceding the last. We tend to put a stress there. So we do say something like mangiato, mangiato, mangiato. The A is a stress. But no one says mangiato. No one does that. But maybe as a non-native Italian speaker, you notice that we tend to stress that A like amare. You notice that, and then you overdo it because that's the one feature you identify. So you want to sound Italian, and oh, Italians do that. Now I'm going to make it so obvious and so loud that people are going to think, wow, you're so Italian, but they won't, because you will basically go past what would have been natural, and now you sound weird and you go amare. No one does that, and it's in fact quite ridiculous. The same can happen in any accent. So first step, identification. Second step, kill that overcompensation. Relax. The third point that I want to make today is practice, practice, practice. As with anything, once your technique is correct and what you're doing is right, absolutely most critical, the next thing is practice. So you've got to be patient. Even after identifying some sounds and noticing some characteristics and making sure that you don't overcompensate, this will improve dramatically, like literally night and day, once you apply these two things. But then you'll still need practice. And maybe you will immediately notice some differences. Like after you start noticing these things and applying them and you don't overcompensate, you'll be like, hey, I sound pretty good. But then wait a year, listen to a recording of yourself, and you'll be like, gosh, I sounded so bad. You didn't sound bad. But comparatively, if you keep doing it and you keep sticking to it, well, then you will progress so much. You make so much progress that then you're looking back at how you were trying to sound at first, you yourself will notice huge improvement and difference. Another point that I like to bring up is listen and ask for feedback. Listen to and ask for feedback. So if someone tells you, we don't really sound like that, we say it like this instead, that's gold for you. So don't get offended. Don't think they're being overly critical. Don't try and tell them they're wrong or prove them wrong. If a native speaker, when it comes to pronunciation, when it comes to grammar, sometimes native speakers are wrong. But when it comes to pronunciation, listen to them, because they have an ear that you don't have, no matter how good you are. So if someone tells you, the way you sound there, it's not exactly how we say it. We say more like this. Listen to them. It's gold. And in fact, you might want to ask some of your friends, particularly if you're very close. Don't ask a stranger, but if you're very close to a friend of yours and you're trying to speak their language and you want to sound like your friend, or maybe you want to sound like another town, it doesn't matter because they're still natives, so they can tell. Like, I'm from Sicily, but I can tell you if you really sound like someone from Milan or not. So in that case, ask them for feedback. Tell them, hey, I'm trying to work on my pronunciation. I want to get this specific accent. Can you tell me what I'm doing wrong? Can you tell me if is that how they pronounce it? And then maybe try and say that word. Last point is sentence level intonation. Once again, this needs its dedicated video, but understand that not everything is about single word pronunciation. Oftentimes you can, on its own, pronounce a word absolutely perfectly. Like, let's take the word water. Water. I believe I pronounced it pretty nicely, but let's say I wanted to say it like someone else. I wanted to say it like a Cockney, then I would go water. Or I wanted to sound more like a general American accent, maybe I'll say water. Or maybe I want to sound more like a northern one, water. Drink your water. I don't know, maybe I botched the job. Regardless, if I try to put these words into a sentence structure, I will sound horrible. So even if I did an okay job, singularly, if I try and put them into a sentence, sometimes, even though I'm pronouncing the single word well, I will still not sound natural. Why? Because sentence level pronunciation and intonation are a completely different kettle of fish, and they require their own work, which I will talk about on a dedicated video. Now, thank you very much for listening to this, and as always, thank you for joining Metatron's Academy.